Hi, I'm Scott. I stole something from a homeless person. One day I walked outside my apartment and there was a dog sitting there in my driveway. And I used to work in an animal hospital, so I could tell that the dog was sick, but there was nobody around. And the dog didn't have a collar, so I just put her in my car and dropped her off at the animal shelter. And a week later, I got a call from them saying that nobody had claimed her, and so she was too sick to put up for adoption, so they were going to euthanize her that afternoon. They even told me the time, 4 o'clock. And no, it gets funny. So I didn't want that on my conscience because I had, because I was the one who put her there. And but I knew that I couldn't take her because my apartment didn't allow dogs, and even if it did, I was just finally starting to have a social life. I mean, my friend had just taught me how to be charming, and so I was finally having some success meeting women. But nevertheless, at like 5 minutes to 4, I was back at the animal shelter picking up the dog. My plan at the time was to sneak her into my apartment and nurse her back to health and then find her a home as quickly as possible. And I remember that first night, I put her in the kitchen and put some newspapers on the floor, and there was no door in the doorway, so I just put a chair there and then went to bed. And a few minutes later, I turned over to see her standing in the dark beside the bed, just staring at me. And so I put her back in the kitchen and put a bigger barrier in the doorway, but she kept getting out of the kitchen and coming to me, so I figured, this dog must have worked in a kitchen at some point and had some bad memories. And so, so I just turned over and she lay down and that became her sleeping place. And so I didn't want to get attached to this dog, so I purposely didn't name her. But then one day we were walking and this homeless guy starts yelling at me, "Anne, Anne!" And that's when I discovered that not only was her name Anne, but she had been raised on the streets and knew all the homeless people. And suddenly I was cool with all the panhandlers. And it was like Hate Street had become this giant filthy nightclub. And I was dating this girl who knew everyone that worked there. And then the turning point came when I met the ex. She was a 16-year-old runaway named Sheila, and she ran up and hugged Anne and then thanked me for taking care of her. And when I asked her where she had been, she said, the Presidio, like that's the place where homeless people like to summer. And then when I asked her why she hadn't been, looking for Anne, why she hadn't gone to the shelter, she said she just figured somebody else was watching the dog. And that's when I kind of snapped. I don't know if you've ever had this experience when all your politics get in a cage fight with your better judgment, but Sheila was clearly the dog's owner, and it wasn't for me to tell her how to live. But legally, the dog belonged to me. I had adopted her just minutes before a death that Sheila did nothing to prevent. And also, I knew if I gave Anne back, then her life expectancy was pretty short. So I finally told Sheila that she could have Anne back if she could get herself in a stable situation where she could keep a dog. And I even offered to let her use my apartment, my bathroom, my phone, my computer, anything except live there, if it would help her find a place. Sheila made a counter proposal, which was essentially that we have a duel. She and I would stand 20 feet apart with Anne in the middle, and then we'd both call the dog, and whomever Anne ran to would be her owner. But I felt that the possible gain in legitimacy wasn't worth the risk of losing the dog, so I turned her down. Plus, I didn't know what sort of secret street treat she might have to entice the dog. Anne was still very much part of that world. Sometimes, when nobody was looking, I would even lie down on the sidewalk myself just to see how happy it made her. And so, over the next month or so, I found I was really falling for this dog. She was smart and affectionate, and having grown up on the street, she wasn't freaked out by, by strange people or commotion or anything. She was a perfect dog. And ironically, the more attached I grew to Anne, the more empathy I had for Sheila. But then one day my brother called and he said he finally found a woman in LA who would take the dog. So that weekend I drove Anne down to LA and I dropped her off at this woman's house. But the moment I got back in my car, I just started crying. And I spent the next 2 hours just driving around the San Fernando Valley, aimlessly. I kept thinking about a friend of mine who got married really young. She told me that she wishes she had met her husband later so that she could have experienced more life as a single adult, but she knew that if she waited until she was ready to get married, somebody as perfect as her husband wouldn't have been around. I knew I wasn't ready for a dog, but I felt that when I was ready for a dog, I wanted it to be Anne. And then I had this moment like Zach Braff in Garden State when he realizes that, every reason he had for leaving the girl was bullshit, something we already knew because for fuck's sake it's Natalie Portman. And I turned the car around and I raced back, to this woman's house to beg for Anne. And I wish I could say that some inspirational song came on the radio at that moment, like Free Falling or something, but most likely I was listening to Philip Glass at the time, so the transition would have been indistinguishable. So a few minutes later, I was standing on this woman's doorstep getting a lecture about how unfair I was being because her cat had just accepted Anne, and the cat would be very upset if Anne left. But eventually I wore her down and got Anne back. And so now I had basically stolen the dog from 2 women and a cat. And on top of that, I had to find a new place to live. But the .com thing was heating up, so rents had doubled, and nobody was allowing pets. So I bought a house. It wasn't much, but it had a yard. And as I was packing up my things to move out of my apartment, I got a phone call from Sheila. She said that she and some friends were going to travel around the country in a camper so she could finally take Anne back. And I said no. And that was it. Now I was the homeowner denying the homeless. I felt like I was the man to whom I'd always wanted to stick it. There's some stories that we tell so often that they become a routine. This isn't one of those. Instead I gradually worked up a story that was very sweet and heroic and absolutely true, despite the fact that it made no mention of Sheila. And I've told that story so many times that I'd almost allowed myself to forget about this part of it. Serendipity is supposed to be a happy accident, which this was if you ignore all the stuff in the middle. It happened 11 years ago, and I have a house and a great dog as a result. I'm also a volunteer for a group that provides veterinary services for the pets of homeless people. And I haven't seen Sheila around in years, which is good because I hope she's doing well. I hope that she's healthy and living in safety and comfort, but I'm still keeping the dog. Thanks.